Hello and welcome to Back to the Science. I'm Dr. Susan Oliver and I'm a scientist, and this is Cindy Oliver and she's a dog. So it's been a while since we did a video about COVID vaccine misinformation, and the reason for that is just because we haven't seen anything new. Anti-vaxxers seem to be just recycling the same old debunked talking points. But we thought we would double check and see if John Campbell had anything new on it, because he's usually reasonably on the ball when it comes to the latest COVID vaccine bollocks. But no, he just had new videos going over the same old nonsense. However, we happened to notice that he did have a video called Shroud Studies, which is about the Shroud of Turin, that had over 1 million views. Very intriguing. Let's have a look.
If you haven't got time to watch this video, I think the evidence for this being the actual burial shroud of Jesus Christ himself is quite convincing.
That's a big call, as most people believe the Shroud of Turin is a medieval hoax. We will have a look to see what evidence John provides for this. But before we go on, can I please ask that everyone refrains from making any negative comments about John's religious beliefs or anyone else's religious beliefs? It's not nice. And religious beliefs are based on faith, not science. And we only look at science on this channel. And by definition, faith is believing something for which there is no proof. But for the video, we will be assuming that a man called Jesus was executed by crucifixion in around the year 33 AD. Or if it wasn't Jesus, it was a man called Brian.
Here's the picture that you actually see if you look at the shroud itself. This is taken from the 1978 exploration scientific investigation. And this is from the photographer Vernon Miller, available on shroudphotos.com. And this is what you actually see on the shroud, and it's a photo negative. So already I think we can probably see the head, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the moustache, the beard, marks, blood stains. These are being confirmed to be human blood on various parts from what would be we would assume to be the crown of thorns, the scourge marks that are on many parts of the body. And this is what we actually see when you look at the shroud itself. But it turns out that this is a photo negative on an original linen cloth. But the point is, linen is not a photosensitive material, and it's a negative. And of course, it's centuries before photography was developed. Photography only starts, I don't know, about 1830s or something like that. Way before that. And yet we have this photographic negative here.
Right. It's not a photo negative. It just looks vaguely like one. So it's rather irrelevant that photography hadn't been invented at the time the image was made.
So that's that picture there. Now, if we look at again, if we compare this is why it gets really interesting. We compare this with ancient prophecies and ancient scriptures. So this is the prophecy of Isaiah. Just as there are many who were appalled at him, his appearance was disfigured beyond that of any human being. His form was marred beyond human likeness. So what we have to remember is this is a picture of death. The man on the shroud is dead. He's in rigor mortis and is badly beaten up. That's completely unequivocal.
I don't understand what point he's making here at all. He is using a quote that says Jesus was marred beyond human likeness, but then he is showing the picture of the image in the shroud that is a human likeness. But hey, he's got more quotes.
Now, the linen cloths again are attested to in the New Testament. This is Joseph of Arimathea, took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. That's in the Gospel. So this linen cloth, and as we'll see, the headcloth as well, is clearly mentioned in the ancient scriptural texts.
This is one of many examples of where John points out that the shroud is consistent with what is written in the Bible. But of course, if it was a medieval hoax, the forger would have made it consistent with the Bible. Otherwise, it wouldn't have fooled anyone.
No explanation. Many people have tried to duplicate the image and with modern technology and failed to do so. So the idea that this could be a forgery using medieval technology is not really a conscionable theory, because we can't duplicate it now with clever laser beams and all that kind of stuff. That a medieval forger or earlier forger could have done this is not really a credible. I don't see that as a credible view. That's why I lean strongly towards this being a genuine artifact.
You know, I keep finding socks in all these really weird places at home, and I know for a fact that I didn't put them there. I've done a few experiments with a laser pointer, and I can't replicate it. So I think the most likely explanation is that they were put there in the 1st century AD. I mean, I can't think of any other explanation. Of course, the image can't be replicated using modern technology. It wasn't made with modern technology. It dates back to medieval times, and therein lies one of the problems. Anything created today is going to be at least 600 years newer than the image that was made in medieval times. So you can never make something exactly the same. That being said, a number of researchers have made some pretty good reproductions, and this paper here describes one such endeavour. It's a multi-step process, so I won't go into too much detail. But a critical thing is that they needed to use a bas relief for the face and not a real face, as draping linen over a whole body at once left them with an image that was too distorted, which of course suggests that the original shroud wasn't produced from the corpse of Jesus. Anyway, this is what they ended up with at the end of the process. As you can see, it looks quite similar to the original, and apparently it's also chemically similar.
Now, we mentioned before that the shroud contains three-dimensional information from the front and from the back. So what people have done in recent years is they've taken that three-dimensional information and they've used that to generate I think, I'm not sure, it might actually be a 3D printout, but they certainly generated a whole body, a statue from that, based entirely on the three-dimensional information on the shroud itself. And this is what we get from that. So we know that the spatial data eliminates photography and painting. And the posture is that of the deceased in rigor mortis. So this body is in rigor mortis. It has the stiffness of death. It's in rigor mortis. And why is it in this position? Well, it was taken from the crucifixion position. So the arms have been moved down. But we can see that the weight of the body would be slumped on the legs. So the legs are bent, slumped on the bottom nail. And we can see that the head would be hanging down because the body was dead. And the head, it almost looks like it's got a pillow propped underneath it. Not at all. It's because the head was hanging down and the body went stiff while it was still on the cross. And we get this, this position.
Okay, so according to the Bible, Jesus died at about 3 p.m. and his body was removed and entombed before sundown at 6 p.m. It usually takes about 6 hours for rigor mortis to be noticeable in the large muscles. So the timings don't really work. And even if there was a reason for rigor mortis to occur more quickly, which can happen in some conditions, the Bible makes no mention of removing the rigor mortis from the arms prior to placing Jesus in the shroud, or even of his body being stiff when it was removed from the cross. And speaking of the body, this study here found some anomalies in the image of the shroud that were inconsistent with it being a real body. In particular, they found that the left arm was 7 to 10 centimetres longer than the right arm.
So the blood is still somewhat red, and the reason that the blood is still somewhat red appears to be because it's very high in bilirubin, a pigment that will stay red, in this case presumably for 2,000 years. As a result of the trauma, there would be breakup of red blood cells. So the blood of the traumatized person of the shroud would have been remained red, whereas ordinary blood would fade.
For those of you who don't know, bilirubin is the orangey yellow pigment that is responsible for the yellowish colouring of people who have jaundice. If Jesus' blood had been high in bilirubin, you would think there would be some mention in the Bible of him looking yellow when he was on the cross, but there wasn't. In fact, a number of different hypotheses have been put forward for why the blood on the shroud is redder than it should be. The blood being high in bilirubin has been shown not to be responsible for the colour. However, there is an hypothesis that involves bilirubin and UV light that can explain the colour. And there are also hypotheses that suggest pigments were added to the blood to make it look brighter, which just happen to fit the available data. And while we're talking about blood, these researchers did some blood pattern analysis on the blood found on the shroud and showed that the blood stains can't all have come from a body in the same position. Some look like they'd been made when a body was standing up, and some look like they'd been made when a body was lying down.
But of course, you're now going to say that this whole thing has been disproved by radiocarbon dating. So in 1988, this study came out, and this team of scientists from around the world who were able to obtain some of the cloth said that this was generated in 1260, between 1260 and 1390. Now, it's not quite as clear-cut as that, because a lot of the information from this only arose from Freedom of Information requests decades later. But carbon dating is a highly accurate methodology. So I am convinced that the sample that they took from the top left-hand corner of the shroud did in fact give this carbon date. So that is accurate science from 1988. Given the sample that they were given, this is accurately the carbon-14 dating, and it's a highly reliable method of dating. But further studies have shown that this part of the cloth that was analysed, as well as containing linen, which is throughout the shroud, apparently it also it does actually contain some cotton as well, which was not part of the original shroud. So what it looks like, and looking at this this part of the shroud again, it looks like it's been repaired with more modern materials, probably in the medieval period, and this has been studied really very extensively. So it looks like they just picked a bit of a bad bit to study, even though they gave it to 3 universities. It was in very close bits. But within the bits that they took for the universities, there was separation of a couple of hundred years in the bits that they took. So what seems to have happened is there's been a repair, and they've also found there was some more modern resin over this, which was plant-based resin, so it's carbon-based. So the date that we have here, this radiocarbon date, while accurate, actually seems to represent an average of the original older material presumably from the 1st century, with the modern material probably from about the 1500s, that gives this date as an average for the amount of material there. But there was quite a lot of heterogeneity within the different samples. And this paper here, I mean, there's you can't go into this in that much detail. You know, some people do, but I've gone into it in some detail. But there's so many papers that now say that we can't rely on this. It doesn't say it's 1st century. It just says we can't rely on this this sample. So this paper here, for example, peer-reviewed journal, studies on the radiocarbon sample from the shroud. The radiocarbon sample area is uniquely coated with a yellow-brown plant gum containing dye lakes. Now this would be much later material. Pyrolysis, that is heating to basically turn it to gasification. Mass spectrometry results from the sample area coupled with the microscopic and microchemical observations prove that the radiocarbon sample was not part of the original cloth of the Shroud of Turin. The radiocarbon date thus not valid for determining the age of the Shroud of Turin. Now, this doesn't tell us what the date is. It just tells us that the sample that was taken was badly selected.
Well, I must say that I am quite heartened to see that John does accept carbon dating. But what about all the other claims that he made? Well, we will look at them all in turn. Let's start with the paper that John showed towards the end that supposedly showed that the sample wasn't taken from the original shroud. Another paper published in the same journal 10 years later shows that it is totally bollocks. The paper was called "There is no mass spectrometry evidence that the C14 sample from the Shroud of Turin comes from a medieval invisible mending." And what they demonstrate in this paper is that the only difference between the mass spectra of the samples taken from the different parts of the shroud is the presence of a contaminant with a long aliphatic chain. Once the peaks associated with the contaminant are removed, the spectra are identical. In other words, there's no yellow-brown plant gum containing dilates. And if you think about it, the idea of them doing invisible mending in the corner of the shroud when they used really obvious patches to mend the fire damage in the middle of the shroud is ludicrous. Finally, invisible mending isn't actually invisible. It can easily be seen by experts. And it just so happens experts have looked at it and there is no evidence to suggest that the sample taken for the radiocarbon dating wasn't the same as the rest of the shroud. But hang on, what about the cotton that John mentioned? It is true that they found some cotton fibres in the sample, but they were only found when the samples were pulled apart. There is no way of knowing if they are also in the rest of the shroud because, of course, it hasn't been pulled apart. It's not remotely surprising that cotton fibres have been found in the shroud because the looms used to make linen fabric would be the same looms used to make cotton fabric. So it would be easy for cross-contamination to occur. What about the heterogeneity in the radiocarbon results from the 3 different laboratories? Again, this is true, but the difference between the laboratories' results is decades, not centuries. And there is a pretty viable hypothesis for why it happened. An important step in radiocarbon dating is to first thoroughly clean the sample to make sure that you are actually dating the sample and not surface contamination as well. It turns out that one of the laboratories, the one in Oxford, used an additional step in their cleaning procedure, which means they could have done a better job of removing a specific type of trace contamination than the other 2 laboratories. And it was the Oxford laboratory that dated the sample to the earliest time, which is consistent.
And then there's also some newer studies. This one, for example, X-ray dating of, this is a new method. I don't pretend to understand it, of course. X-ray dating of a Turin Shroud linen sample, inspecting fibre structure degraded by means of wide-angle X-ray scattering. This experimental results, and this only came out, when did this come out? I think this is 2024. This is brand new stuff. The experimental results are compatible with the hypothesis that the Shroud of Turin is a 2,000-year-old relic.
It's not a new paper. It was published in 2022 and it was published in a journal from MDPI, which, as we've discussed in previous videos, generally doesn't perform rigorous peer review. This, of course, by itself doesn't mean the paper is dodgy. They do still publish papers that are fine as well. It's just the luck of the draw. Anyway, I wasn't familiar with the technique they used to date the sample, so I decided to look it up. And it turns out that it was developed by the same authors in 2019, and the paper describing it was published in the same NDPI journal. And the technique has not been validated or even used by anyone other than the original authors. Furthermore, the method has been calibrated with samples from places with completely different climates than Europe, where the Shroud of Turin is known to have been since at least the 14th century. And to the best of my knowledge, none of the calibration samples have been in a fire, unlike the Shroud of Turin, which definitely has been. And this is a major problem because the method involves looking at the extent of deterioration in the fabric fibres. Exposure to extreme heat is likely to accelerate deterioration, as would more humid conditions like they have in Europe. Even different microbes could have an effect. Finally, this isn't directly relevant, but a number of the authors of the paper have previously published other studies related to the shroud that have subsequently turned out to be bollocks and had to be retracted. The current paper probably won't be retracted, but that's because MDPI hardly ever retract dodgy papers. Now, John does present a lot of other so-called proof that the shroud is genuine, but this video is getting a bit long, so I'll leave it there. If you would like to look further into it, I'll provide you with a link in the video's description to a playlist from a channel called Reason to Doubt that covers all the talking points made by shroud believers and why they are not valid. And of course, as always, I'll provide links to everything that I've covered in the video's description too. If you've got this far, thank you for listening. And if you've liked, shared, or commented on the video, double thank you, because that helps the algorithm and means that more people will see the video. And of course, thank you to everyone who has bought me a coffee or little sleepy Cindy here a treat. Oh, those eyes are a little bit open. We really appreciate your support. We will be continuing to make videos about the science in the future. So if you'd like to join the cool kids and stay informed, please hit the subscribe button. And this is likely to be my last video before Christmas, which is why I'm wearing my Christmas shirt. So for everyone who celebrates, we hope you have a wonderful Christmas. And for everyone who doesn't celebrate, have a wonderful day too.